Welcome back into the Daily Dose. I'm Jeff Hansen. What a weekend it has been for BYU. The Cougars go to Fayetteville, big underdogs, and they get the best of Arkansas. It's been fantastic. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. You've been celebrating. I've been celebrating. This has been a fantastic weekend to be a BYU football fan. Thank you for coming and starting this new week with us here at the Daily Dose. It's a good time. It's a good time. I'm Jeff Hansen. I'm your host. The show is brought to you by feastbox.com. You've heard of Cougar Feast, but if Cougar Feast, if a 12-person meal that's BYU branded, has swag, has proteins for everybody, has sides, has plates, if all of that is too much for you, and it is a lot, believe you me, if all of that's too much, feastbox.com. You can order just the meat. They have taken the hard part of meal prep. They've taken care of it. They've taken the headache away. You can check it out, feastbox.com. You can order any of their proteins, and it will get sent to you right to your door. Their roasted chicken breast, it's like $10.95 for 4 or 5 servings. You divide it up, you put it in your meal prep, and you're good for the week. It's great. It's fantastic. Tastes good. All of their meat, even more than what's available in their restaurant, is available online at feastbox.com. We appreciate them for sponsoring the Daily Dose. Boy, what a weekend. It really was such a great weekend. 38-31, and even that score is kind of misleading. The game could not have started worse for BYU. They give up a long home run, touchdown run on the opening drive for Arkansas. BYU doesn't quite go 3 and out. I think they had that penalty in there. There was a pass interference that resulted in a first down. But then they quickly punt. Arkansas returns the punt for a touchdown. At that point, it looks like the wheels are completely fallen off. It looks like everything is going awry, that BYU has lost control. It's the kind of punch that BYU maybe, probably, definitely would have broken their jaw in years past. But BYU, they take the punch. Then they take the left hook. They take a couple of punches there in the first 3 minutes of the game. And after those first 3 minutes, they go on to win 38-17 after the first 3 minutes. I mean, BYU really, really dominated. So great win. Great win for BYU. Exciting game and a lot of momentum now in Provo. They play Kansas this week. Similar in terms of really good quarterback in Jalen Daniels, very good running back, very good offense. BYU should be able to find a little bit more success on their offense. The Kansas defense isn't quite what Arkansas is, but we're not here to talk about Kansas yet. We're here to reflect on Arkansas. So big momentum, big win. Awesome. I want to talk about available yards. We've talked about available yards. It's one of my favorite stats, one of my favorite advanced metrics. What is an available yard, in case you haven't heard me talk about it? Available yards removes penalties. I mean, it doesn't remove penalties. It accounts for penalties differently. In its most simplest form, an available yards is if the ball is on the 20-yard line, I could gain 80 yards. Doesn't matter if I gain 15 with a pass interference call. It doesn't matter if it's a running play. It doesn't matter if I lose 10 yards and then gain those 10 yards back. I have 80 yards to gain. Those are the available yards, and those are the only yards we care about with this metric, available yards. So when you look at box scores, you'll see things like you saw against Arkansas. Total yards, it looks like Arkansas dominated this game offensively. They had 424 yards of offense compared to BYU's 281. But if we look at it from an available yards perspective, BYU gained 317 yards that were available to them, and Arkansas gained 361 yards that were available to them. It wasn't this huge disparity. How do you account for that? Why is there that discrepancy? Because Arkansas could not get out of their way. They had holding penalties. They backed themselves up. They put themselves in long down and distances. And as a result, Jay Hill's defense didn't have to stop them as much for a 2-yard gain. When it's 3rd and 12, you'll give up 8 yards and feel pretty darn good about it. And that's what BYU did throughout the game. From an available yards perspective, Arkansas gained 34.6% of the yards that were available to them. BYU gained 34.1%. These two teams offensively were pretty evenly matched. They moved the ball with about the same level of efficiency. The difference in the game was on the defensive and special team sides of the ball. BYU dominated defensively. They really did. I know they gave up 424 total yards, but like I say, if it's 1st and 25, BYU's not worried about giving up 10 yards on first down because that would still lead to 2nd and 15. And those were the kinds of situations that Arkansas found themselves in over and over and over again. And BYU took advantage. From a field position standpoint, BYU absolutely dominated in the field position game. I want to just read this to you directly from my list. The starting field position for BYU. They started their first drive at the 20-yard line. Then after that, the 47-yard line, 47-yard line, 41-yard line, 45-yard line. That was 4 straight drives that they were on the 40-yard line or better. BYU owned field position. 30-yard line, 13-yard line, 25, 25. Then things got a little bit more normal. But then in the second half again, 30-yard line, 50-yard line, 80-yard line, 31, the 80, sorry, the opposing 20-yard line. BYU just controlled the field position all game long. And then you compare that to where Arkansas was, and they had pretty average to bad field position throughout the game. 25-yard line, 8-yard line, 25, 26, 25, 28, 30. They were very rarely on the plus side of the field. They had a lot of available yards to gain because they had a lot of they had a lot of total offense because they had a lot of available yards to gain. And then when you have all of those penalties as well, you have to continue to gain more yards in order to get to 0, right? I mean, if you gain a 10-yard run, you gain 10 yards. But then if there's a holding penalty on your next play that calls that back, the ball is back to where you started. Your 10 yards are negated, but the box score still counts those 10 yards. So then when that running back runs for 8 more yards and they punt, well, BYU got a punt. They got off the field, but Arkansas got 18 total yards of offense on that drive, despite the fact that they really never moved the ball 10 yards and got that first down because of penalties. Available yards, that's the metric that I like. When you really look at it and you break it down, BYU's offense, Arkansas's offense, pretty darn efficient. BYU to only have 281 offensive yards and still be able to score touchdowns, that's huge. That's what they do. When BYU scored touchdowns, they had a 53-yard drive, a 55-yard drive. They did have a 70-yard drive, but then they had 20 yards and 69 yards. I mean, they were dealing with short fields throughout the game. So no, they did not gain as many yards, but when they take over with short fields, when they get plus field position because the defense does well and they capitalize on that, total yards kind of punishes them. And it says, hey, you only gained 20 yards on that drive. Well, they scored a touchdown. They only could have gained 20 yards on that drive. Available yards tells them, no, you gained 100% of the yards available to you, and that's the goal. So that's how you kind of explain that difference of how Arkansas outgained BYU and still lost. When you really break this down, BYU was the better team offensively throughout the game. They were efficient, and they did what they needed to do. And it started with the offensive line. It wasn't a perfect game from the offensive line. Caleb Etienne did get pulled. Braden Kime played the majority of the snaps, especially in the second half. It wasn't a perfect game from the offensive line, but it was their best game so far. And Arkansas is a very, very good defensive front. Maybe the best defensive front short of Texas that BYU is going to play this year. So for the BYU offensive line to improve while playing against that Arkansas front, that's huge progress. That should make BYU fans feel confident going into the rest of the year that, okay, maybe this offensive line has figured some things out. The running game wasn't super great, super effective, but it was effective enough that it had to be a threat. LJ Martin had enough big runs, showed enough burst, especially on that touchdown run, that Arkansas had to take the run seriously. Even if it wasn't a 250-yard running game for BYU, it was effective enough that Arkansas couldn't just sit back and make Keaton Slovis do all the work. They had to respect the run, and that really was BYU's goal going into this one. Against this defensive front, you're probably not going to run for 200 yards in that game, but run well enough that they have to respect it. That box was checked. Huge kudos to the offensive line and to LJ Martin for making that happen, and kudos to the coaching staff for making some difficult decisions. It's not all perfect. BYU still's got to figure some things out. The safety position, Malik Moore, he got pulled after taking a really, really bad angle on that long touchdown run on Arkansas's opening drive. And that was the last we really saw of Malik Moore. The safety position has been hit with injuries. We all know that. Malik Moore's not playing well. It's tough. Ethan Slade has played well. Crew Wakely, he's now hurt, but he played well. Tanner Wall has played well. But it's not a weapon for BYU. It feels like Jay Hill's having to scheme around that a little bit. So that's something to watch going forward. But by and large, this defense played exceptionally well. The offensive line for Arkansas had a million penalties. Why? Because the BYU defensive line was dominating the tone of that game. They were aggressive. They were physical. They were the better team in the trenches on Saturday. BYU gets credit for that. A year ago, we would have never dreamed of making that statement. That just seemed impossible for BYU to do. The defensive line was so bad a year ago that didn't seem like that was even a sentence that we would ever be able to utter out of our mouths. And yet, BYU's offensive or defensive line dominated the Arkansas offensive line all game long. They bottled up the run game for the most part, save a few long runs, and they were constantly getting to KJ Jefferson. There weren't always sacks, although they did have 4 sacks on the night, but they were getting to KJ Jefferson. They were keeping him off schedule, and they made him uncomfortable. The defensive line, Jay Hill, Sione Pua, huge credit to all of those guys. They made that happen. Kelly Papinga, huge credit. This was an exciting time to be a BYU fan. There's no question about it. The Cougars showed that they are a very good team that should be taken seriously this year. I've seen a lot of Arkansas fans lamenting the fact that they lost to BYU. And I get it. BYU's not Alabama. And I'm not going to sit here and try to claim that BYU's been one of the elite teams in college football. They lost to Liberty last year. They lost to East Carolina. They've had some disappointing losses. There's no question about it. But Arkansas kind of joined a pretty elite club of teams who have lost to BYU over the last 10 years. Texas has lost to BYU twice. So has USC. Arizona's lost to BYU 3 times. Wisconsin has lost to BYU. Michigan State. Tennessee. I mean, it's not like BYU is never beating a team like Arkansas, right? They're beating Power 5 teams like this each and every year. And now they're in a Power 5 conference and they've got a chance to do it with more consistency and on a bigger stage and blah, blah, blah. But Arkansas fans, there's no shame in losing to BYU. I'm not saying act like it's hey, you lost to Georgia. You just shrug your shoulders and say, well, it was Georgia and you move on. That's not what I'm saying. But there's no shame in losing to BYU. Some of the biggest brands in college football have lost to BYU and lost to BYU recently. The Cougars are a good team. They're well coached. Kalani Sitake proved that once again. And I think the Big 12 is taking notice of what BYU did against Arkansas and saying, hey, whoa, maybe we need to take the Cougars a little bit more seriously going into conference play here next week. I'm expecting a big punch from Kansas. It's going to be a tough game, another tough game for BYU. But they kind of put the conference on notice that said, hey, look, we're not just happy to be here. We want to contend. Do I think BYU is going to win the conference? No, I don't. But I think they're going to show that they should be taken seriously throughout the year. They could win every single game. I don't think they can go 9-0, but I think any game on the schedule, maybe not Texas, any game on the schedule, BYU can win on an individual weekly basis. They absolutely can, and they proved that this week. It's an exciting time to be a BYU fan. I'm excited to talk about this Kansas game. Jalen Daniels and this Kansas offense is one of the most exciting offenses in the conference, and I'm excited to get to break it down with you guys this week and talk about how BYU could defend it and how does BYU, follow suit. What does the second act look like of BYU's P5 schedule? It's a big opportunity for them. Appreciate you guys taking the time to tune in to the Daily Dose, and until next time, give them hell.